Welcome back to Restored Gospel Podcast, where we're friends having casual conversation on the things of eternity. We welcome you into that conversation. We're continuing on our little series here on Book of Mormon proofs and things that outside of just the text itself that kind of debunk maybe some lies or arguments out there against the Book of Mormon. So I'm going to turn it over to Shane because we've got a lot of material and I'm looking forward to hearing what he has. So Shane, it's all yours.
All right. Good morning, everybody. All right. So this section is going to be on anachronisms, which anachronisms are things that are out of place that shouldn't be there. When you look at a photograph of, like, say, a black and white photograph from the 1920s, you wouldn't expect to see, a laptop or something like that. So to illustrate that, I recently came across this painting by Leonardo da Vinci, and I wanted to see if you guys think that this is a legitimate painting.
I'll say no.
And obviously this is not Leonardo da Vinci. This was actually my AI, but finding a cell phone in ancient Rome obviously doesn't fit. So that's anachronistic. And so a lot of people have claimed over the years that there are these things, these elements of the Book of Mormon that are anachronistic because they're trying to prove that it can't be true because of such items. And so what's interesting is that if you study this, you find that, many of them, there are a few things that we can't explain, that, in time will probably come forward. But I wanted to bring out a whole bunch of things that have been debunked. Because there's a lot of stuff running around out there that is just off base and unfounded. And this started early on. So we got this quote from Alexander Campbell in 1831. Of course, Alexander Campbell was the pastor of the Church of Christ. It was the church where Sidney Rigdon attended and was a pastor. And so he was vehemently against the church because of Sidney Rigdon taking so many members away from their group. So this is what he said. He said, Nephi knew all about steamboats and the compass 2,400 years ago, and this was in a thing he published. And so, obviously there's nothing in the Book of Mormon about steamboats, and the only compass in the Book of Mormon is the Liahona, and it's not a compass that uses magnetism. It's simply being led by the power of God. And so it's really a completely inaccurate statement, and anybody that actually reads it will see that it is. But the layman might just read it and say, oh, yeah, that Book of Mormon, and just want to dismiss it. And so there's been things like this that have happened all through the years. Here's another one. This was in the Christian Watchman magazine. It's dated 1837, and it's entitled Mockery on a Stagecoach. And this guy says, and he in this article, he's telling a story about a ride he took on a stagecoach and where he basically shamed a Mormon. And so he says, I stated that I had read the Book of Mormon enough to find the terms gunpowder, mariner's compass, and several other recent origin introduced into a silly story of the exploits of one Nephi, who it appears was a rather conspicuous character in the affair. And the story related to events which were said to have transpired about the time of Cyrus, say 700 or 800 years before Christ. There are also references to pistols and other firearms. And what caps the climax for absurdity, we find a literal quotation from Shakespeare in a narration of an occurrence some 600 or 700 years before the Christian era. When I named this, the passengers burst into involuntary laughter, and one which was something increased by the poor Mormon, who remarked that he presumed the line of which I referred was borrowed by Shakespeare himself from the Book of Mormon. And so, just totally making a ridicule of the book, saying, this is so ridiculous. But if you notice the things he listed, pistols and, these are things that are not spoken about in the Book of Mormon, but it's just people don't take the time to read it and really see what's there. They just listen to the hearsay and write it off. And so there are things in there that are there that were a surprise and didn't make sense in 1830. But before I get into those, I wanted to talk a little bit about carbon-14 radiocarbon dating. And I don't want to get too sciencey here, but it's important that we understand a little bit about carbon-14, because a lot of the anachronisms that are found in the Book of Mormon are because scientists say they couldn't have dated to that period. So I wanted to show that radiocarbon dating has some challenges. So it's an amazing discovery, and I'll explain what I mean by that. So here's a little history. So in 1940, Martin Kamen and Sam Rubin discovered the isotope carbon-14 while studying at UC Berkeley. Then 6 years later, a physicist named Willard Libby proposed that carbon-14 could be used to date organic material. So anything that ever lived that was alive at one time could be dated with this carbon-14. And then from 1947 to 1949, Libby and his team, they did these experiments using samples that they knew the age of. So that they took some Egyptian tomb artifacts and other things, and they tested their theory if this would work. And so it appeared to be accurate. And so in 1960, Libby was awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry. And so let's talk about the principles upon which carbon-14 dating is based. So basically the way it works is cosmic rays come from outer space. They collide with nitrogen atoms in our atmosphere, and that converts nitrogen-14 into carbon-14. So then carbon-14 gets mixed up in our oxygen, and it forms CO2, which is then absorbed by all plants and animals, and it enters into the food chain that way. And then after an organism dies, their body stops absorbing carbon-14. So basically the absorption of carbon-14 ends right then, and any carbon-14 in the body will begin to break down. And so the carbon-14 decays back to its original nitrogen-14, and it has a half-life of 5,730 years. So they can measure this rate of how it breaks down and calculate a time at when this organism died. That's the theory and how it works. And so by measuring that, they can figure out the time of death within, fairly good accuracy. And it's a great theory. I mean, it's a great idea. It works great. It's really fascinating, but there are some problems with it. And so it's only effective up to 50,000 years, which I know seems like that should be plenty, right? But remember, we're dating dinosaurs back to the millions and millions, 60 million years, things like that. So I really can't use carbon dating for that kind of thing. Modern carbon or fossil carbon can skew results. So if newer carbon gets mixed up with old carbon that you find like in a tomb or whatever, that can mess up your results. And it can go the other way. Old carbon can mix with newer stuff and make it look a lot older than what it is. There's a big problem with water. So marine samples can appear a lot older because of ancient dissolved carbon. So if you had two animals and they both died and you buried one in the dirt and one in a lake, the one in the lake may appear a lot older because it has older carbon from the lake bed or whatever that mixes in with it and makes it appear a lot older when it's dated. And so you think about that in terms of the flood. The whole earth was flooded, so that anything after the flood is, or before that we think is from before the flood, is going to be affected, right? So nuclear testing and fossil fuel emissions get up in our atmosphere, and they also affect the carbon-14 levels. And then there's these assumptions that scientists make about it. So they say that the ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12 in the atmosphere has remained constant over time. We have no idea of knowing if that's true. They just assume that it has. And if you believe in the flood, the pre-flood Earth would have had a larger biosphere, would have been further out into space, and it would have had a different magnetic field, which would have skewed all those ratios. Once an organism dies, they assume that once an organism dies, that no carbon can enter or leave the sample. But yet there's been lots that have been contaminated from groundwater, microbial activity within the cells, and then environmental radiation, that just comes from the ground, can affect carbon-14 levels. They assume the half-life of carbon-14 is 5,730 years, and that has remained unchanged, and there's no way to know that. And so catastrophic events could alter those decay rates. So when you think about the flood, you think about what happened at the time of Christ, the destruction in America, where all the cities were destroyed and the whole face of the land was changed. I mean, all of that would have affected the carbon, because stuff would have been released from volcanoes and earthquakes, and stuff would have been released from in the ground, and would have affected everything. Carbon-14 dating is valid up to 50,000 years, is their assumption. But they're having some trouble with that because you can actually detect carbon-14 in coal and also in diamonds. And supposedly they're millions of years old. So how is it able to detect it if it only lasts about 50,000 years? So there's some flaws in the logic. But in a perfect environment where there's no change, nothing's affecting it, it's a great theory. It works great. But there's just so many other things that affect it, especially if you believe in a flood. So here's some examples where carbon-14 dating had some problems. And I promise this won't last too much longer. I just wanted to give a good base. So some of the things we're going to talk about refer to dating. So 1963, there was 2 scientists that tested a living mollusk. It was live, right? And it dated to 2,300 years old. Could have been a case of contamination from the ocean. They don't know, but it dated to that old. In 1975, Troy Pure tested, they had a mammoth, and he tested the same mammoth, different parts of the mammoth's body. One part dated to 29,500 years, and the other dated to 44,000 years. In 1984, 2 scientists that they tested live snails. They dated to 27,000 years old. In 2018, Stuart Manning and his team from Cornell dated the same tree, and they found an offset of 19 years. So one group tested one side, one the other, and it was off by 19 years, which, this wasn't a tree that was thousands of years old either. That's quite a bit for how recent the tree was. And then ongoing study. So this, again, like I mentioned, the fossil fuels, diamonds, they all sometimes will yield carbon-14 dates of 10,000 years, and they're supposed to be millions of years old. So these are just some of the examples of the carbon dating where there is some challenges in its accuracy. And so just because a scientist says, this was, 28,000 years old or whatever, we don't need to just automatically accept it. There are lots of errors and lots of assumptions in that process. So let's start off with any comments before we move on?
I'm good.
Okay. So we'll start with elephants. So in the Book of Ether, it says, I'll just read it. It says, in the space of 62 years, they had become exceeding strong, insomuch that they became exceeding rich, having all manner of fruit and of grain and of silks and of fine linen and of gold and of silver and of precious things, and also all manner of cattle, of oxen and cows and sheep and of swine and of goats, and also many other kind of animal, which were useful for the food of man. And they also had horses and asses, and there were elephants and kiralams and cumans, all of which were useful unto man, more especially the elephants and kiralams and cumans. Now, we don't know what kiralams and cumans are. I don't believe. I couldn't find out. But elephants, we obviously know what elephants are. So when this came out in the 1830s, this was just a huge, joke. It is like, what, elephants? Because, we're in America. Here you've got, this book that's supposedly a record of these Native Americans. All they've ever seen is, is guys on horses chasing buffalo. Elephants. It just sounded so crazy. And so here's some quotes. And these are modern quotes. These aren't from back then. This is from 1982. The picture of this ancient civilization in the Book of Mormon doesn't fit with what we know from archaeology. There were no elephants, no horses, no wheat, no steel. Here's another one. This was in 2018, so just a few years ago. The presence of the elephant in the Book of Mormon text is just one example of anachronisms that do not fit the scientific consensus. All right, so the question is, were there ever elephants in America? And that's, now granted, I'm not saying, it could have been throughout thousands of years, but were there ever elephants on this continent? And so we have the archaeological record shows us that there were, in fact. In 1866, a mastodon was discovered at Harmony Mills, New York, and it's displayed at the New York State Museum. In 1890, a mastodon was found in Macedon, Ohio, and you can imagine how it got its name, by a farmer. In the 1900s, mammoth and mastodon bone bed that were found with stone tools were found in Kimmswick, Missouri. So humans interact, they had stone tools interacted mixed with these bones. In 1930, a mammoth was found with a Clovis point, which is kind of a spear type thing, a spearhead, was found in New Mexico in a cave. In 1977, a mastodon rib was found in Washington with a projectile in the bone and dated to 13,900 by Texas A&M in 2023. Now, keep in mind, they're using carbon dating, so it's, you never know if it's 100% accurate, but the fact that they found a mastodon in Washington with a projectile, spear or arrowhead in its bone, it shows that that men and mastodon, men and elephants were here. 1979, mammoth bones with knife cuts dating to 24,000 were found in Yukon and Canada. 1992, mastodon bones dated to 130,000 years, which is interesting. But there was some human modification. And so the science world said, that's impossible. There weren't humans here 130,000 years ago. So, I would argue the dating was probably off, but anyway, that was what they produced. And then in 2022, they found a mammoth butchering site in New Mexico. The University of Texas dated it to be 37,000 years old. And then in 2023, in the La Brea tar pits, they found a mammoth and mastodon bones. They were dated that year to 12,900 years ago. And then the last one, there was mammoth blood residue found on Native American tools in the Carolinas that dated to 13,000 years. So there were both mammoths and mastodons all over what is now the United States and Canada. Now, the dating, you could argue, you could say, well, that's not Book of Mormon times. But again, I don't know that we can trust the dating 100%. So we'll move on to the next one. So another one that we get that the church gets made fun of or the Book of Mormon gets made fun of is for horses. So I'll pull the scripture up. This actually has a number of what used to be considered anachronisms in it. It says, and it came to pass that we did find upon the land of promise as we journeyed in the wilderness that there were beasts in the forest of every kind, both the cow and the ox and the ass and the horse and the goat and the wild goat and all manner of wild animals which were for the use of men. And we did find all manner of ore, both of gold and of silver and of copper. And it came to pass that the Lord commanded me, wherefore I did make plates of ore, that I might engraven upon them the record of my people. And upon the plates which I made, I did engraven the record of my father, and also our journeys in the wilderness, and the prophecies of my father, and also many of mine own prophecies have I engraven upon them. And so, there's a number here. So cows, oxes, horses, goats, gold. They know gold and silver were here, but they claimed in 1830 that the Indians knew nothing about how to work these metals. They were in the ground, but they knew nothing of them, according to the accepted perspective. And that, of course, has since been proven wrong in many, many times over. But I found this interesting. Look at this. This is what Wikipedia says about horses in America. It says, the Book of Mormon mentions horses in 5 instances and are portrayed as being in the forest upon first arrival of the Nephites, raised, fed, prepared in conjunction with chariots, used for food and being useful unto man. Horses in the Americas are considered to have become extinct between 10,000 and 7,000 years ago and did not reappear there until the Spaniards brought them from Europe. Horses were reintroduced to the Americas, the Caribbean, by Christopher Columbus in 1493, and the American continent by Cortez in 1519. Mormon archaeologist John L. Sorensen claims that there is fossil evidence that some New World horses may have survived the Pleistocene and Holocene transition, though these findings are disputed by other Book of Mormon scholars. Alternately, Mormon apologist Robert R. Bennett suggests that the word horse in the Book of Mormon may have referred to a different animal, such as a tapir. And so this is kind of interesting because this is a tapir. And so it doesn't really seem likely they'd be riding around on this.
Shade.
Yeah.
I got a question. When you were reading that scripture earlier about, there were horses and elephants and cumulons and cumons. It's interesting that there's words that we understand today, horses, elephants, and then there's these words, curum, cumulon, just not in our vocabulary today. Any thoughts on why God would, some of those would be translated into words we know and then some not? I mean, I was wondering maybe those that aren't, maybe those are now extinct or not part of our current, animals that are here, or is God leaving those in for future evidence someday that will vindicate, what was written there?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. It'd just be speculation, but the word dinosaur didn't appear until around 1830. Before that, they were called dragons. So the cumulons and cumulons could have easily been some kind of a animal that's gone extinct. Maybe not a dinosaur. I don't know, but I think it's certainly not something we have today, or otherwise probably God would have given him the word for it.
Right, and that's why I wonder with like this word taper. It's like, well, that could have been a horse. Well, but wouldn't God have used a word that we would have known then? So trying to go anyway. That was just on my mind.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Okay, so I had a little fun with the AI here. So I decided to make a couple of pictures. So here's a picture of Captain Moroni on his trusty taper. Here's King Lamani in his chariot being pulled by a taper. So, I mean, I know it's silly, but anyway, I don't think it's even reasonable to consider. But, I don't feel like we need to try to find things that fit. I feel like the science it'll show up eventually, and it has. So let's look at a little bit here. So the Smithsonian is now, admitting that there were horses here. Now, not during the Book of Mormon period, but this is out of the Smithsonian Magazine 2023. It says horses evolved in the Americas around 4 million years ago. Of course, everything's millions of years because they need evolution to work. But by about 10,000 years ago, they had mostly disappeared from the fossil record, per the conservation. Spanish settlers likely first brought horses back to the Americas in 1519 when Hernan Cortez arrived on the continent in Mexico, per the new paper Indigenous Peoples, when transported horses along the network trade routes. So if you continue on in time, basically, I mean, that was in 2023, but this article was put out by S&J Scientific in 2012, and they're actually admitting that there were horses here later than that. So here it says there were no equus samples found in this study in Mesoamerica. They did a study in Central America to see if there were horses. They didn't find any. It says in Mesoamerica for the time interval of 14,700 BC up to 1650 AD. By contrast, in North America, there are found equus samples which do indeed appear in the time frame between the last ice age and the arrival of Columbus. So here you have a secular scientific magazine saying that there were, in fact, horses here before Columbus arrived. It wasn't Columbus that brought all the horses. It says the first of these was found in Pratt Cave near El Paso, Texas, by Professor Ernest Lendius of Texas A&M University. Professor Lendius responded to my inquiries and provided a horse bone from Pratt Cave, which dated to BC 6020 up to 5090, which obviously is before the Book of Mormon time. But then it says, this date is well since the last ice age into the time from when all American horses should have been absent, according to the prevailing paradigm. Another equus specimen was identified by Elaine Anderson, an expert on equus identification at Wolf Spider Cave, Colorado. It dated to AD 1260 to 1400. So there's an example of a horse that was here way before, the white man came. So
it's interesting too that, for those detractors from the Book of Mormon, just citing that, there's no horse bones or whatever down in Central America, may not be aware that, although that's been the typical idea of where the Book of Mormon happened, that there's also a body of thought and work out there that it actually happened up in North America, right? So people use that data to show, well, there's no horses in Mesoamerica, but up here where there's possibly the Book of Mormon really did take place, North America, here you have evidence of it.
Yeah.
Well, and that last one is really powerful, because if they're saying there were horses here at 1260 AD and nobody external introduced them, then they had to be here all along.
Yeah, exactly.
It's kind of,
Yep.
just because you haven't found one dated 600, they didn't just appear.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
600 BC. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. All right. So, and there's actually been a whole lot more evidence come forward. And I won't go into a whole lot of detail, but I just want to show you some of the pictures. So this, of course, they dated at 3.7 million years, but this was found in Idaho. This was found in Utah, 8,000 BC. There's a cave approximately 1,000 BC it's called Horse Thief Cave. I can't remember which state it's in, but it's got horse drawings on the walls. And then this chart, I didn't make this chart. I'm not sure who did, but it's got all these locations, who discovered it, where it was discovered, and the age in which it was dated. Some of them are 900 AD plus or minus 100 years. The YBP is years before present. So some of them are 700-800 years old. Some of them are 1,745 years before present, 3,190 years before present. So the full period of the Book of Mormon, Jaredites and Nephites, are covered by these findings that they've found here in modern times. But those that have stood by the narrative that there were not horses here and therefore the Book of Mormon must be false, they're not willing to look at this other data and see that in fact there were horses here.
That top left box is a geoglyph, a cave writing. Is that what that is? A cave
I think so.
picture?
Yep. Yep.
Okay.
All right. So another thing that they often mocked us about was barley. And so barley, they believed it was developed in Europe. And so the mention of barley in the Book of Mormon, it was an anachronism. Didn't make sense, right? So this is kind of a case of academic lag. So the scripture, what it says in Mosiah, it says, "And we began to till the ground, yea, even with all manner of seeds, with seeds of corn and of wheat and of barley." So barley and wheat are two separate things. It's not just generically calling it barley. And with knees and with shom and with seeds of all manner of fruits. And we did begin to multiply and prosper in the land. So this was published in 1993 by Sandra Tanner. I know a lot of people have heard of them, Gerald and Sandra. She said, "Barley was unknown in the New World before the arrival of the Europeans. The Book of Mormon's mention of barley is therefore a serious problem for its authenticity." And what I mean by a case of academic lag is, so what happens is when these scientists do these deep studies, they study this stuff for years, maybe 10 years, and they write these papers and they double check and they have their peers review their writings and all that before it's actually finally published in a peer-reviewed, format to where they can say, this is firm, all these other scientists have confirmed my studies are correct. So academic lag is where, the modern thought is, well, this didn't happen, but they didn't realize that there are some studies that had occurred prior to them that they just hadn't made public yet. So this in 1983, so 10 years prior, V.L. Bohr, who was a non-LDS archaeologist, found they discovered barley, and it says it is reasonable to conclude that we are looking at North American domesticated crop whose existence had not yet previously been suspected. And so that was found in an Arizona State University dig. It was in Phoenix. And it was pre-Columbian, so prior to Columbus, domesticated barley, and it dated to about 900 AD. And that was published in the Science 83 magazine. So obviously, Gerald and Sandra just didn't know, maybe because it wasn't, they just weren't aware of the study, or I'm sure they wouldn't have made the comment. But there was in fact domesticated barley in the United States, during the time of the Book of Mormon. Okay, another one is copper. So the Book of Mormon mentions working in gold and copper and brass, and that was another thing that was a laughing stock in the 1800s. There's no way these Native Americans, they're making stone arrowheads, they're shooting bows and arrows, they don't make tools. They don't make copper stuff. They don't make weapons out of copper. They don't have shields and swords, and none of that made any sense based on what they saw when they first got here. But after digging up the mounds and, kind of decimating the East Coast, they found a lot of things. The picture here is some copper tools, spearheads. On the left there, these actually have they're hollow in the middle right here, and you can slide that over a pole, and it becomes a big spear with a copper head to kill. There's also all these copper decorations and artwork that they have made. They've found them all over the place. And I mean, we're not talking about a couple of places. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of these things. And they date, back to sometimes as late as 1000 BC. They're very old. Here's a quote from David Pompiani. He's a geologist at the Kansas State University at Manhattan. He said, "Earth's largest and purest copper deposits are found around North America's Great Lakes. At some point, Native Americans learned to harvest the ore and heat, hammer, and grind it into tools. They left behind thousands of mines and countless copper artifacts, including lethal projectile heads, hefty knives and axes, and petite fish hooks and awls. Today, it's not uncommon to meet residents of the region who have buckets of copper artifacts that they've found tucked away in their basements." So the next item is the scimitar. The scimitar is mentioned in the Book of Mormon a couple different times. It's always mentioned with swords. So it says they had swords and their scimitars. They had their swords and their scimitars. It's always together. This one's out of Alma. Yea, they did arm themselves with swords and with scimitars, and with bows and with arrows, and with stones and with slings, and with all manner of weapons of war of every kind. And so these examples here are not Book of Mormon era, but I just want to show you what a scimitar is. It's basically a curved sword. Sometimes they have a little thicker area on the back, but that's what a basic one looks like. And so in 1857, Samuel Hawthorne Waite said, "The scimitar, a Turkish weapon, not known until after the time of Muhammad, is one of the evidences of the Book of Mormon's modern origin." So he's saying there's no way this wasn't created until after Muhammad in Turkey. There's no way that these Native Americans had scimitars, right? Here's another one, James Couch, 1921. He said, "Reference is frequently made in the Book of Mormon to swords and scimitars. The use of the word scimitar does not occur in other literature before the rise of Mohammedan power, and apparently that peculiar weapon was not developed until long after the Christian era. It does not, therefore, appear likely that the Nephites or Lamanites possessed either weapon or the term." So he's saying they wouldn't even know what it was called, let alone have them. And then Antonio Andrews in 1981 said, "Is there a reasonable explanation for the Book of Mormon people allegedly having had scimitars that originate in the Orient, when they allegedly had no contact with the Orient?" So again, mocking it. And so then that was what people were saying even up into the 1980s. And so time has changed that story. So the question is, were they really created in Turkey in the 8th century? And the answer is no, they were not. This picture here is a tomb in Egypt, and it was found in 1999, and it was a warrior that had a scimitar. You can see right here, the scimitar was in the grave with him, and dates to before 1500 BC, so well before Nephi, and that was in Egypt. Here's one in Haifa, 2004. It's a curved sword. It was found. It dates to 1550 BC. Here's another one, Balata Sikkim in 1987. This is a sickle sword, so they call it a sickle sword, but it would be considered a scimitar as well. It was found in Israel in 1500 BC, or it was found to date back to that time. It was found in 1987. Here's some more images. These are found in the Americas. So this is a sword, the handle would have been made of something else, wood, bone, something else. But this guy's holding one he found that was found on the shore of Lake Superior. And so you've also got these other things. Some of them would have been like, used as like spearheads. And then here's another curved, here's a scimitar. So the evidence is out there. But, people have to be willing to look at it and not just go with the narrative. And so that brings us to Nephi. So 600 BC, Nephi's in Jerusalem, and he's told by God to slay Laban and, to get the plates of brass. So it says, and when I came to him, I found that it was Laban, and beheld his sword, and drew it forth from the sheath thereof, and the hilt thereof was of pure gold, and the workmanship thereof was exceeding fine, and saw that the blade thereof was of the most precious steel. Well, this idea, this most precious steel, has really caused a lot of people to make fun of the Book of Mormon. And I've got a bunch of examples of that throughout time here. So here are some experts starting back when the Book of Mormon first, came out, basically. This was dated to 1884. This guy says, Laban's sword was steel. When it is a notorious fact that the Israelites knew nothing of steel for hundreds of years afterwards, who but as ignorant a person as Rigdon would have perpetrated all these blunders? So they're blaming Sidney Rigdon for allowing that to come forward. He should know better. He was an older guy and a biblical scholar. He should have known that. He should have never let Joseph publish that. This is from 1911. Laban is represented as killed by one Nephi some 600 years before Christ with a sword of the most precious steel, hundreds of years before steel was known to man. This is from 1920. The Book of Mormon speaks of the most precious steel before the commonest had been dreamt of. Another one from 1920. Nephi wielded a sword of the most precious steel, but steel was not known to man in those days. Laban here's another one from 1932. Laban had a steel sword long before steel came into use. 1957. Every commentator on the Book of Mormon has pointed out the many cultural and historical anachronisms, such as the steel sword of Laban in 600 BC. And then 1964, no one believes that steel was available to Laban or anyone else in 592 BC. And so if you were living in 1965, for example, and you read all these articles, it could probably shake you a little bit. If you didn't have a testimony of the Book of Mormon's truth and the Spirit of God that has confirmed it to you, you would probably read that and think, oh man, maybe I am dumb for believing this, right? Well, now history has changed that narrative. So this is from 2005. It's a book called The Heart of Steel, a metallurgical interpretation of iron in Homer. It says archaeological evidence indicates that the advent of consistent, deliberate stealing of iron occurred by 1000 BC, and that production of carburized iron objects increased rapidly after 900 BC. And here's another one. This is taken out of his book from 2012. His name was Lloyd Weeks. He's a professor of archaeology at the University of New England in Australia. He says, evidence for and he actually quotes some other authors in here, which is why you see references to other authors. But anyway, he says, evidence for the intentional quenching and tempering of carburized steel comes from 11th century BC sites such as Lapithos, Adalion, Amathus, and Kuklia scales on Cyprus. This is matched by the 12th, 11th century BC pick from Mount Adair in Israel that is made of quenched and tempered steel, and possibly by an even earlier Middle Bronze Age blade from Pella, Jordan, of quenched steel, although its archaeological content is questionable. In other parts of the Near East, however, iron with consistent carburization and little or no evidence for developed heat treatment continue to be produced well into the first millennia BC. Biblical scholar Philip J. King also explained wrought iron heated in contact with charcoal or carbon at high temperature produces carburized steel or carburized iron or steel, which is more malleable than cast iron. Steel can be hardened by quenching, practiced as early as the 10th century BC, that is, cooling off the red-hot steel by sudden immersion into a vat of cold liquid. And these guys aren't talking about the Book of Mormon. They're talking about the fact that steel is a lot older than they originally had thought. The science world is acknowledging that. And so these are some other, I'm not going to read them. I'm not going to read the quotes, but I just want to show you these references. So these are more references. All of these are referencing steel at the Book of Mormon period or before. Okay, so, and if that isn't enough to convince anyone, they actually have a surviving steel sword in the Israel Museum. And here it is. So this, it says microradiographic X-ray examination and photography of the sword indicate that the hilt, ridge, and blade were prepared separately and then forged together by hammering. Metallurgical analysis of a sample taken from the blade proves that it was made of mild steel and that the iron was deliberately hardened into steel, attesting to the technical knowledge of the blacksmith. The sword is 1.05 meters long and has a double-edged blade. Over the years, it has become cracked due to corrosion. And that was published in the Biblical Archaeological Review in 1986. And then another article was written in 1994. So now we can see one. We can see a steel sword that dates back to that period. And so now there's no argument. It's very possible that Nephi had a steel sword. So any comments?
Yeah, pretty fast.
Go ahead, Mark.
I was going to say pretty fascinating. And also, I looked up this geoglyphs so that we don't give bad information. It's not cave writings. It's large designs or patterns made on the ground, like the Serpent Mound. Can you, let me just hold this up here. This is a spider geoglyph.
Oh, yeah.
Hang on.
So
Mark.
there you go. So apparently there was a horse one found based on that box in that chart that Shane had shown. So anyway, I just wanted to correct that so that we knew what a geoglyph really was.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate that. That's kind of like those ones down in South America, that in I forget what they call those, but anyway, there's a bunch of those in South America. Yeah,
absolutely.
So this is just science catching up with the Book of Mormon, basically.
Yeah, with Revelation and the Word of God. And
I wonder one day when prophetic writings come from maybe some of the other tribes, or writings are found from Zenock and Zenos, that we're just waiting for science to catch up with the Book of Mormon continually. And so far, if you follow the trajectory, it's vindicated, in every situation. All of these arguments are now, now the Book of Mormon is being vindicated. And again, how many things does Joseph Smith have to hit right on the head before people realize he wasn't writing the Book of Mormon? He was actually translating actual records, as he claimed.
Yeah. Well, and that's the same thing has happened with the Bible. There's been, people made fun of, like there's people that say, oh, there was no King David, there was no King Solomon, and then all of a sudden they find these seals and all these things they're digging up in Jerusalem,
right,
that prove that there was a kingdom and all that stuff, that the temple was there and all that. But
wasn't it the prophet Zedekiah or something on a ring that actually, that's crazy.
Yeah. Yep. Well, and they just recently found the Pool of Siloam, which they thought was, myth.
Fairy tale.
So, yeah. All right. So we'll keep going. So this is kind of towards the end here. I just wanted to throw in a couple of things. There's some names here that are anachronistic as well. The name Sam, when it first came out, they just laughed, because you got all these kind of biblical sounding names. And then all of a sudden this guy named Sam, which in 1830 would have been short for, Samuel, but why call him Sam, the shortened version of Samuel? It it didn't make sense. They figured Joe Smith made a mistake when he wrote this book, and it was something worth laughing at. So this was written by M.T. Lamb in 1887. He says, the first word that will probably attract the attention of ordinary reader at the beginning of the book is the name of Lehi's third son, Sam. Here is a boy 600 years before Christ who has the unmistakable Yankee nickname for Samuel. There is certainly nothing Hebraistic about the name, or does it sound like any Egyptian name we've ever heard? And then now science has shown that Sam is actually the Arabic form of Shem. And so it says the name Sam, this is by John, I mean, how to pronounce his last name, but he's a Hebrew professor. He says the name Sam is attested on a bronze ring mounted seal dated to the 7th century BC. 7th century BC, that's right there at the time of the Book of Mormon. While others have read this name as Shem, in Paleo Hebrew, there is no distinction in writing between the I don't know, it's called the S with the hash above it and the S with the little U on top. The latter written as sh in English. And so the name, it was an Arabic name, the Arabic form of Shem. And so what's interesting about that is you find that when you go back to the time of Lehi, so Lehi was based, if you read between the lines, now this is not specifically said, it does not specifically say this, so I'll leave that disclaimer. But if you read between the lines of First Nephi, it seems that Lehi may have been a fairly worldly guy up until the time he had his experience. First of all, when they got the brass plates, he did not know that he was of the tribe of Manasseh, which was a shock to him. I mean, here he is living in Israel, which was in the southern kingdom of Judah, which is where the tribe of Judah was, and he's living in that city. He's a merchant of some kind, used to traveling. And all of a sudden he finds out he's from the northern kingdom, which was already dispersed and lost, and the lost 10 tribes. He finds out he's of the tribe of Manasseh, which was a surprise to him. And then you look at how he names his children from that point on. He names them Joseph and Jacob, these Jewish names. Prior to that time, Laman, Lemuel, even Lehi, Ishmael, Lemuel, and Nephi. These are all Egyptian names. They're like Arabic Egyptian type names. Sam is Arabic. And so they were more of probably kind of a world, like it'd be like us calling our kid, like if you were not Christian or whatever, you call your kid, Bob or something like that. And then you convert to Christianity, and now you start naming your children like, Moses or something, something from the Bible. And so you see a change in Lehi. He changes from, just kind of this guy living in Israel in Jerusalem to now this devoted man who's serious. And you can tell the older kids were the ones that were rebellious too. They were used to the world. They were used to Jerusalem and all the pleasures that came along with that. And they were not interested in his newfound religion. But anyway, this seal shows that the name Sam is legitimate, does date back to that time, and is the Arabic form of the name Shem, which, Ham, Shem, and Japheth were the 3 sons of Noah. So it's an old name, and not just short for Samuel.
I think this is huge. I mean, I hope people are catching this. This is huge. If you're trying to argue that Joseph Smith fabricated this book or colluded with other people to fabricate this book, and you're trying to write this sounding like biblical, times, and you're using all these names, and then you throw out the word Sam, it's, if we were writing a book, Shane, we're making up name, Jehoshaphat and Isaiah and Nathaniel and Fred, and, why would you do that? Right. You'd want to stay with, and so now all of a sudden science once again vindicates what seems so laughable at the time. Like, why did you should have done better there, came up with a better name.
Right.
I mean, that's huge.
Yeah, it really is.
And I just want to say too, on a slightly different tangent, but talking about Lehi being worldly, being wealthy doesn't make you worldly. But I've always marveled at Laban, who seemed to be this tremendously powerful man. If he could command 50 at a time, he had a lot of means, that he lusted after their property. So it would take a lot to get a guy like that, you know. So I think Lehi was really wealthy. And then you look at the rich young man who comes to Christ and, you know, sell all that thou has and give it to the poor. That Lehi had such an experience that he was willing to walk away from all that wealth and just pack up his stuff in tents and leave and take none of it with him. All this just speaks to the significance of when that pillar of fire comes and shows on a rock before Lehi. What a significant experience that was, and a change in his life. So, I mean, it would be hard. I don't know. I don't have that much, but to just leave my house and walk away into the woods would be tough.
Yeah, and I'm sure that contributed to Laman and Lemuel's rebellion. I mean,
Absolutely.
they were the oldest sons. They were due to inherit this large fortune, you know, and living the good life in Jerusalem, and then, you know, they had to leave and go live in the desert in a tent. So, be tough. All right. So the other name I wanted to bring up is the name Alma. So Alma is an interesting one because in 1830, Alma was a female name. And so this is Obadiah Dogberry, which I like that name. Sounds funny. In 1830. So this was really close to the time when the Book of Mormon was coming out. He said this. He says, and he's mocking the Book of Mormon. He says, and it came to pass that Alma, being a very pious man, yea, a man of God, did go forth among the people, bringing repentance and faith in the Lord Jesus Christ. And Alma did wax strong in the spirit, insomuch that he did cry aloud, saying, repent ye, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. One of the most ridiculous impostures ever promulgated. Because he's mocking the Book of Mormon in general, but mocking this name Alma. Here's another one. This was in 1975. It says, Alma is a Latin feminine name. It is absurd to think that two ancient Semitic prophets would bear the name that means nourishing mother. This is just one of many examples of Joseph Smith's ignorance of ancient languages. And then here's another one. This was published in 1980. Pastor John L. Smith and Robert McKay found it uproariously funny and patently ridiculous that two supposedly ancient and more or less Semitic men bore what everybody knew to be a woman's name with a Latin etymology. So, up into the 1980s, it was like, this is just stupid. You're using a woman's name, from this Latin base. I mean, why would you do that? He obviously is an idiot, So now they have to change their tune. So they found these tablets. They fit in the palm of your hand. There's multiple of them. They're called the Ebla tablets. And they date back to 2100 BC. And the name of Alma appears in the Ebla tablets. And it actually appears, I think it was 9 times. It's a bunch of times in the tablets. And it's referring to a man named Ebla. Also, there was a man named Alma ben Yehuda, which the name appears in the Bar Kokhba document. So the Bar Kokhba revolt of 132 was when they, the final war against Rome, basically, when the Jews were, completely defeated. But in some of those documents, there was a man referred to multiple times named Alma ben Yehuda, and Ben means son of. So it was definitely a man, Alma, the son of Yehuda. So here you have it. It's obviously an ancient Hebraic male name, and really can't be disputed. So that's what I had for this portion. We want to go ahead and call it a day for this one.
Well, just to summarize, I mean, put yourself back in time, and you're this young 16, 18-year-old boy, 20 years old, trying to con a bunch of people, picking the absolute right names, using using names that sound unbiblical or un-Hebrew, like such as Sam. So many things here, using metals that at the time they said there's no way, naming specific animals, and then at other times leaving names that we don't know for whatever reason, which I imagine maybe someday also science will catch up. But so far along the line, every time there's these arguments, it bears out that no, every one of these little minor points is now being vindicated. And for years, how many people walked away from the church because of the Book of Mormon and because of these people that were against it, and even the Tanners and with good intentions, using science that's now been completely debunked and still on their website. At least it was several years ago when I looked there, because I started looking at arguments against the Book of Mormon. And, the first few were, one of them was horses and other things. And so they're still being passed around as arguments against, even though there's so much information that states otherwise, right? And so it's always, why are you searching? What's your agenda? What are you trying to find? And putting out data to support you without looking at the full body of work.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting, the other side of the coin too, Mike, that I've walked away from the church largely because of the Book of Mormon.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just a interesting dichotomy that the church doesn't resemble the church in the Book of Mormon.
Right. The spiritual things, even what Shane pointed out earlier about, you have to kind of read between the lines, but, Lehi with the names of the sons, and then this conversion or this huge experience, which set him completely out of his culture, and he took off obeying God, and how the names changed. Think of the underlying ideas and theology if you were creating this book, to put all of those little things in there and to have the wherewithal that, people will someday, they'll understand what we're, just to make the mystery seem more real. I mean, come on, at some point you have to say it takes so much more faith to think Joseph Smith created this book than it was a divine, work of God, right? In the translation process. And just reading that title page again this week, it says it would become forth by way of Gentile, but to be translated by the power of God. In using those interpreters, this is the power of God giving us these words. And that's why every time these things are vindicated, because of course God knows. But a young boy and without the internet, cut off from in rural New York, would never know all of these things. It just wasn't available.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love it. Well, Shane, man, that was great. Thank you. Hopefully this helps people that maybe have heard some of these lies along the way and has added to them doubting that a lot of these, and then also to question things that maybe aren't or are still in process, to realize of all of these other things are showing to be true and these arguments are being debunked. Why hang your hat so much on maybe some other things that, well, maybe that sounds okay, but maybe there's another reason why, these arguments aren't true, because so far they're proving to be, they're just falling flat, right? And they have to change their tune, like you said, Shane.
Yeah, and I think it's important that we make the point that there are still some anachronisms in the Book of Mormon that I can't explain. Yep, and that science can't explain. And I'll give you one: glass. So they talked about with the barges, of Brother Jared, that they couldn't be of glass because they would shatter in pieces in the ocean, right? Well, so modern thought is that glass wasn't produced until like the Egyptians, well after that. They think the belief is that they were smelting metal and a piece of slag fell onto the desert sand, and there was high concentrate of silicon, and it turned it to glass, right? And so you start seeing glass beads and little decoration things, in the archaeological record as like ornamental stuff, but you don't see like glass sheets, like panes of glass or anything like that till much later. And, part of the problem is those things wouldn't last either. Glass doesn't last thousands of years, so even if they were making it, we wouldn't have any way to know unless they talked about it or they had cave drawings of it or something, But to me, it's one of those things. You've got 100 things here that that are debunked, that were supposedly anachronisms. You got a handful of things that haven't been proven yet, But my faith is not in not in the scientific discoveries or the archaeology or the geography or anything else. It's simply in the fact that God's Spirit has revealed that it's true to me. So when I find things like these things that we've talked about today, they're exciting, but they should not determine whether we believe or don't believe. We need to make sure we go to God and have an actual testimony of what we believe, where His Spirit confirms it, and it's not just using our brains to try to figure out what's true. In
the Bible, John the Baptist even at one point asked, is this the Christ? Is this the one that was to come to save us? And when doubt creeps in to a lot of people, Nephi was in the gall of just sadness and depression and says, woe is me, rise up my soul. I'm sad because of my sins. And doubt happens to all of us. And so even when you have a belief in the Book of Mormon, if you're still on that pathway and if the God is still revealing Himself and you start to hear all of these things, it's natural to doubt. And it's so wonderful to me to show that don't believe everything. There's always an agenda, seek out the full body of work. And I'm with you, Shane. The gospel is so powerful in the Book of Mormon that these things just add to it. But for some, and even for me in my previous, as I began to see so many things that had been taught erroneously in church history, there was those days where I thought, well, then why the Book of Mormon? Why hang on to it? And it was always the gospel first because of the Spirit that has been with me when I've read those words. But there were those days, and it takes things like this sometimes to just kind of, slap you on the back and say, come on, it's true. There's other reasons why these lies are actually lies, right? And we see that. So I think this is very important in our overall faith. And hopefully, go ahead.
I'm sorry, finish up, Mike.
I
think too, once you have a spiritual witness that the Book of Mormon's true, the converse is true, that it exposes theological anachronisms in the churches of today, especially the LDS church. I mean, we've talked so much about why didn't they just preach the Book of Mormon in the simple, pure gospel and not add temples and blood atonement and polygamy. And so if you just go back to the pure gospel of the Book of Mormon, it highlights all those questions with today's church that people used to ask about the Book of Mormon, like horses and steel. Well, why are you guys still doing polygamy? And why do you think there's high priests running around? And why do I just think it's so valuable to get us back to the pure gospel of Jesus Christ. In my little Bible study class I talk about a lot, we talk so much about the traditions of churches and how these people in this class, and me included, just want to almost let go of almost all organized religion and just have a relationship with Christ, because there are so many traditions that bind people down that are created by men in these organizations. And church was never meant to be an organization. It was meant to be people of one heart who follow Jesus Christ.
Amen. Yeah, true in Jesus' day with the religious leaders, the traditions that he had to break down and deal with, and true in our day today, modern day.
Yeah, I think that it is priestcraft to use the beauty and the clarity of the Book of Mormon and the powerful spirit that accompanies it, to try to use that to convert someone to a church.
Mm-hmm.
It's like they've hijacked this beautiful, simple book that points us to Jesus and repentance, and said, see how beautiful this is? We must be the true church. Come join us.
Yeah.
It's a bait and switch, and unfortunately we miss the message because we get all tied up in the church organization, and we forget that we ignore the whole message, which is to repent, right?
Absolutely. All right. Well, hey, Shane, what's coming up next episode?
Oh, well, we'll be talking a lot. We kind of dabbled a little bit here at the end here with Alma and Sam. We're going to talk about some of the things in there that in the actual text, Hebrew language, Hebrew poetry, things that they didn't even know about in 1830. So the actual text itself is, to me, is the strongest proof of the truth of the Book of Mormon if you're trying to prove it. So we'll go over that.
All right. We're looking forward to that. I think we're all kind of excited that this is going to be a fun one coming up as well. So, hey, man, thanks again for your research. Remember, be kind to one another in the comments and in discussions. Remember, we're walking each other home. So until next time, God bless.
See you guys.